The knocking came at 2:17 in the morning. Keith Brennan stood frozen at his front door, one hand gripping the frame, the other instinctively reaching for the gun that hadn't been there in 3 years. Through the peephole, a woman. Bruised face, split lip, eyes darting behind her like something was hunting her in the dark. She wasn't supposed to be here. Nobody was. He'd buried that life the day Rachel's casket went into the ground. The woman knocked again, harder this time, and whispered something that made his blood stop. "Please. They have my daughter." Keith's jaw tightened. His daughter Holly slept 20 feet away, dreaming innocent dreams he'd sworn to protect. This stranger was dragging violence to his doorstep. But when he looked through that peephole one more time, he saw something else. Something that reminded him why Rachel used to say, "We save people, Keith. That's what makes us human." What he did next would break every promise he'd made, and cost him more than he ever imagined. Keith had been dreaming about Rachel again when the knocking started. The same dream he'd had for 3 years. Her smile in the airport terminal, luggage at her feet, waiting for him to come home from Syria. Except in the dream, he always arrived too late. The terminal was always empty, her smile always fading into white hospital lights and the steady flat line of machines that couldn't save her. He woke with his heart hammering against his ribs, the phantom sound of that monitor still echoing in his skull. Then the knocking came, real this time, urgent. He pulled on jeans and moved through the small house he'd bought after leaving the Navy. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like the pancakes Holly insisted on making every Sunday, a living room with furniture from thrift stores. But it was theirs. Safe. Quiet. The kind of place where 8-year-old girls could grow up without knowing their father had once killed men in 17 different countries, without knowing he'd been good at it. The best, his commanding officer used to say, until Rachel died, and being the best at killing didn't matter anymore. The woman at his door looked like she'd walked through hell to get there. Mid-30s maybe, dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, despite the October cold. The bruise around her left eye was fresh, purple spreading into black. Her lip had been split recently enough that dried blood still crusted at the corner. But it was her eyes that stopped Keith from closing the door. They held the kind of terror he'd seen in war zones, the kind that came from knowing death was close and closing in fast. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice shaking. "I know it's late. I know you don't know me. But I saw your truck in the driveway, the veteran plates. I thought maybe you'd understand." Keith said nothing. His training screamed at him to shut the door, lock it, call the police, get between this stranger and Holly. But his hand stayed on the doorknob, frozen. "My name is Veronica Hayes." The words tumbled out in a rush. "My daughter. Zoe, she's 9 years old. They took her. They're keeping her in a warehouse by the river, the old textile mill on Hancock Street. I escaped, but I can't go to the police. They have someone inside. I don't know who. If I call them, they'll know. They'll kill her." "Who are they?" Keith's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Traffickers." Veronica's face crumpled. "They grabbed us outside our apartment 2 days ago, threw us in a van. They've been moving us around, keeping us separated. Tonight I got away when one of them got careless. But Zoe's still there. She's so scared. She's just a little girl." Keith felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You need to call the FBI. They handle trafficking cases." "There's no time." Veronica grabbed the doorframe, steadying herself. "They're moving her at 4 a.m. That's less than 2 hours from now. By the time the FBI mobilizes, she'll be gone." "Please, I saw your truck. I saw the seal emblem on your rear window. You know how to do this. You know how to get in and out. I'm begging you." The words hit Keith like a fist. Navy SEAL. He hadn't been called that in 3 years. Not since the day he'd walked into his commanding officer's office and put his trident on the desk. Not since the funeral, when they'd tried to give him Rachel's flag and he'd left it on the casket because he couldn't bear to touch it. He'd promised himself that day. No more violence, no more missions, no more becoming the thing Rachel had always feared he'd become. Just pancakes on Sunday, and helping Holly with her homework, and fixing leaky pipes for $70 an hour. "I can't help you," Keith said. "I'm sorry about your daughter. But you need to find someone else." Veronica's face went white. "There is no one else." "Then call the police and take your chances." He started to close the door. Veronica didn't move. She just stood there, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face, and whispered, "If it was your daughter, would you wait for the police?" The door stopped halfway closed. Keith's hand was shaking now, because he knew the answer. He'd known it the second she'd said the words, "my daughter." If someone took Holly, he wouldn't wait for anyone. He'd burn down the world to get her back. "Daddy?" Keith turned. Holly stood in the hallway in her unicorn pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She looked so small in the darkness, so breakable. The sight of her punched the air from his lungs, the way it did every time he remembered how close he'd come to losing her too. Rachel had been driving to pick him up from the airport. If he'd taken a different flight, caught an earlier plane, stayed another day in Syria, Rachel would still be alive. Holly would still have a mother. The math of loss never stopped calculating itself in his head. "Who's that?" Holly asked, looking past Keith to Veronica. Veronica's breath caught. She stared at Holly with such raw longing that Keith felt it in his chest. This woman wasn't lying. She had a daughter, and that daughter was in danger. "Just someone who needs directions," Keith said softly. "Go back to bed, sweetheart." Holly didn't move. She looked at Veronica's bruised face, at her split lip, at the way she was holding herself like something inside was broken. Then Holly asked the question that destroyed Keith's last defense. "Daddy, what would Mom do?" Keith closed his eyes. Rachel's voice echoed in his memory, clear as the day she'd said it. They'd been arguing about his re-enlistment, about whether he should take another deployment. She'd been holding Holly, who was only 5 then, and she'd looked at him with those steady brown eyes and said, "We save people, Keith. That's what makes us human. But you have to decide what kind of saving matters more, the kind that happens overseas, or the kind that happens when you're here for your daughter every single day." He'd chosen wrong. He'd taken the deployment, and Rachel had died, waiting for him to come home. "Go back to bed, Holly," Keith said quietly. "I'll be there in a minute." Holly hesitated, then padded back down the hallway. Keith waited until he heard her door click shut before turning back to Veronica. His jaw was tight enough to ache. "How many are there?" Veronica's eyes went wide. "You'll help." "How many?" "6 that I saw. Maybe more. They have guns. Automatics." Keith ran the math. 6 armed men. Likely trained, or at least experienced. A warehouse with multiple entry points and limited cover. A hostage situation with a child's life on the line. 2 hours until the window closed. It was a suicide mission. The kind he'd run 50 times in the teams. The kind that got people killed when they went wrong. "I need 10 minutes, Keith said. "Wait here." He didn't wait for her response. He walked back through the house, past Holly's room where he could hear her breathing soft and steady, into his bedroom. The closet smelled like mothballs and old leather. He pushed aside winter coats until his hands found the lockbox in the back corner. His fingers remembered the combination, even though his mind had tried to forget it. 4, 18, 22. Rachel's birthday. The Sig Sauer P226 sat in its foam cradle like a sleeping snake. Keith lifted it, feeling the familiar weight settle into his palm. Muscle memory took over. He checked the chamber, loaded the magazine, chambered a round. 15 bullets. He had 3 more magazines in the box, 60 rounds total. Probably not enough. Definitely more than he wanted to use. He found the tactical vest in the bottom of the closet, buried under old photographs he couldn't look at. Rachel smiling on their wedding day. Rachel holding newborn Holly in the hospital. Rachel alive and whole, and never knowing that Keith would fail to protect her when it mattered most. He shoved the photos aside and pulled on the vest. It fit looser than it used to. He'd lost weight, stopped working out the way he had in the teens. His body had softened into civilian life, even as his nightmares stayed sharp. In the bathroom mirror, Keith barely recognized himself. The man staring back had Rachel's death carved into every line of his face. 3 years of grief and guilt, and trying to be someone his daughter wouldn't be afraid of. But underneath that, the seal was still there. Cold, efficient, ready to do terrible things for the right reasons. He grabbed a black jacket to cover the vest and the gun, walked back to the front door, where Veronica waited, hope and fear fighting for control of her expression. "I'll get your daughter," Keith said, "but you need to do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that?" Veronica nodded so hard her whole body shook. "Give me your phone." She handed it over. Keith pulled up her text messages, found one from a number labeled Zoe, and typed, "Mom's friend is coming. Trust him." He sent it, then immediately deleted the message from the sent folder. If Veronica was telling the truth, the traffickers wouldn't be monitoring a 9-year-old's phone. If she was lying, Keith would know soon enough. "What's the layout of the warehouse?" Keith asked. Veronica pulled in a shaking breath. "Big open floor, metal containers stacked in the center. They're keeping Zoe in one of the containers. Second row, blue door. There's an office on the west side where most of them stay. Cameras at the front entrance, but the loading dock in back is blind. That's how I got out." Keith absorbed the information, already building the tactical picture in his mind. "How are they armed?" "Pistols on their hips. I saw 2 with bigger guns, the kind with straps. Rifles. Any explosives? Grenades?" "I don't know. I don't think so." Keith nodded. "You're going to drive me there. Park 2 blocks away. Then you're going to call 911 from a payphone and report gunshots at that address. Tell them officer needs assistance. That'll get them moving fast. But you said not to call the police." "I said there's someone inside they trust. I didn't say the police shouldn't come. We just need to control when and how." Keith checked his watch. 2:38. "We need to move now." Veronica stumbled toward an old Honda parked across the street. Keith followed, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that he was making the same mistake he'd made in Syria, that he was choosing violence over being there for Holly. But what choice did he have? A 9-year-old girl was trapped in a shipping container, waiting for men who saw her as inventory. If Keith did nothing, he'd spend the rest of his life knowing he could have saved her, that he'd let another child lose what Holly had lost. Just like Rachel said, "We save people. That's what makes us human." They drove in silence through empty streets. Portland at night looked like a different city. Streetlights threw long shadows. The Willamette River reflected moon and bridge lights in patterns that looked almost peaceful. Keith rolled down the window, letting cold October air sharpen his focus. His right shoulder ached where an insurgent's knife had found him in Kabul. His ribs remembered the IED blast in Helmand. His hands knew exactly how to kill, quickly and quietly. He'd spent 15 years becoming a weapon, 3 years trying to forget how. The textile mill rose against the skyline like a tombstone, 6 stories of dark windows and corrugated metal. Most of the complex had been abandoned for a decade, leaving it to transients and drug dealers, and now, apparently, human traffickers. Veronica parked 2 blocks north, just like Keith had told her. She killed the engine and turned to him with desperate eyes. "Bring her back," Veronica whispered. "Please." Keith didn't answer. He was already gone, sliding into the operational mindset that had kept him alive through 200 missions. Emotion was a luxury. Doubt was a death sentence. Right now, he wasn't Keith Brennan, father of an 8-year-old girl who made Sunday pancakes. He was Petty Officer First Class Brennan, and he had a target to neutralize. He approached the warehouse from the southeast, using abandoned cars and dumpsters for cover. The loading dock was exactly where Veronica said it would be. Metal door hanging open 6 inches, no guards visible, either sloppy security or a trap. Keith crouched behind a rusted forklift and watched. Waited. Breathed. His instructors at Budditz used to say patience was the SEAL's greatest weapon. Most men died because they moved too soon. 3 minutes passed. 4. Then Keith saw the orange glow of a cigarette near the northwest corner. A guard doing a lazy patrol, more interested in his smoke than his job. Keith marked the pattern. 30 seconds to the corner, 45-second pause, 30 seconds back. Predictable. Fatal. Keith moved during the guard's pause, closing the distance in absolute silence. He'd crossed 50 meters before the guard even turned around. When the man did, Keith was already inside his range, hand clamping over his mouth, arms snaking around his neck in a blood choke. The guard struggled for 7 seconds before going limp. Keith lowered him to the ground, zip-tied his wrists and ankles, gagged him with his own shirt. 1 down. The loading dock door opened into darkness. Keith pulled a small tactical flashlight from his vest, but didn't turn it on yet. He let his eyes adjust instead, finding shapes in the shadows. The warehouse floor opened up massive and empty, exactly like Veronica described. Metal shipping containers were stacked in the center like a maze. Somewhere in that maze was Zoe Hayes. Keith moved along the wall, using container shadows for cover. He could hear voices now, coming from the office on the west side. Male voices, laughing about something. The sound made his blood cold. These men were trafficking children, and they were laughing. He'd killed for less in the Middle East. Much less. The blue container was exactly where Veronica said. 2nd row, 40 feet from the office. Keith approached low and fast, pressing his ear to the metal door. Nothing. He tried the handle, locked from the outside with a heavy padlock. Keith pulled the bolt cutters he'd grabbed from his truck, positioned them carefully, and squeezed. The sound of shearing metal seemed loud as a gunshot in the silence. He froze, waited. No reaction from the office. He opened the door slowly, wincing at the scrape of metal on metal. Inside the container, a small figure huddled in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up at him with eyes too old for a 9-year-old face. "Zoe," Keith whispered. The girl nodded, not speaking. "Your mom sent me. We need to go, right now. Can you walk?" Zoe stood on shaking legs. She was wearing what looked like the same clothes she'd been grabbed in, a purple jacket over jeans. Her face was tear-streaked, but her eyes were sharp, alert. Survivor's eyes. Keith had seen them before on rescued hostages. This girl had been through hell, but she hadn't broken. "Stay behind me," Keith whispered. "If I tell you to run, you run. Understand?" Zoe nodded again. Keith led her back along the path he'd taken, moving slow and careful. They were 20 feet from the loading dock when a door slammed somewhere behind them. Voices, suddenly sharp and alert. Someone had found the guard, or checked on Zoe. Either way, the window had just collapsed. "Go," Keith said, pushing Zoe toward the loading dock. "Run to the street. Find the blue Honda 2 blocks north. Get in and lock the doors." "But go!" Zoe ran. Keith turned back toward the voices, pulling the Sig Sauer from his jacket. He didn't want to shoot, didn't want to become that person again. But men were spilling out of the office now, armed and angry. Keith counted 4. No, 5. One of them shouted something in Spanish. Another raised a pistol toward Zoe's retreating form. Keith fired twice. The first round caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him. The second hit his gun arm. The man went down screaming. The others scattered, returning fire. Bullets sparked off metal containers around Keith's head. He dropped behind a forklift, return fire controlled and precise. These men weren't trained soldiers. They moved wrong, exposed themselves wrong, fired wild. Keith put 2 more down before the remaining 3 retreated back toward the office. Silence fell, broken only by groaning from the wounded. Keith's ears rang from the gunfire. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. The smell of gunpowder brought back memories of Syria, of Kabul, of every firefight he'd survived. He'd promised himself he'd never smell that smell again. But here he was, breaking promises. He started to retreat toward the loading dock when a new voice stopped him cold. "Keith Brennan." The voice came from the office doorway. A man stepped out, backlit by fluorescent light. Tall, lean, with the kind of precise movements that marked military training. He wasn't armed with a pistol. He carried an AR-15 held low and ready. "You don't remember me," the man said, "but I remember you." Keith said nothing. His mind was racing through faces, deployments, missions, trying to place the voice. To crit. 2018. You and your team hit a weapons market. My brother was there. Wrong place, wrong time. You shot him in the street like a dog. The memory surfaced, like a drowning man breaking water. Not to crit. Al-Qaim. A night raid that had gone wrong. Intelligence bad. Too many civilians in the target zone. Keith's team had taken fire from a rooftop. He'd returned fire. A man had fallen. Later, the after-action report said the man was unarmed, a bystander caught in the crossfire. One of 17 deaths that night that shouldn't have happened. "Luis Reyes," the man said. "My brother's name was Carlos. He was 23 years old, engaged to be married, and you killed him for being in the wrong place." Keith's finger tightened on the trigger. "I didn't know." "You didn't care." Luis's voice was flat. "Dead." "None of you cared. You came into our countries, kicked down our doors, killed our families, and called it service. Well, I'm here to collect payment. By trafficking children? By making you feel what I felt." Luis raised the rifle slightly. "Veronica did good work, bringing you here. Took 6 months to find you, another 3 to set this up. Her daughter really is in that container. But you're the real target, Keith. Always were." Keith's blood went cold. "What are you talking about?" "Veronica works for me. Her daughter's safe with my people across town. Has been the whole time. This was about getting you here. Getting you to break your vow. Getting you to become the killer again." Luis smiled, and it was the cruelest thing Keith had ever seen. "And it worked. You came running, just like I knew you would, because that's who you are. A weapon that can't stop pulling its trigger." Keith felt the world tilt. Veronica had played him. The bruises, the fear, the desperate mother act. All of it a lie to draw him out, to make him pick up a gun, to turn him back into the thing Rachel had died believing he could leave behind. "Now, here's the choice," Luis said. "You can die here, and your daughter grows up an orphan. Or you can put down that gun, and I'll let you walk out. Go home to Holly. Never look back. All you have to do is abandon Zoe. Leave her in that container for my people to collect. Prove you care more about your kid than someone else's." Keith's mind raced. Zoe was real. He'd seen her, touched her, sent her running. Even if Veronica had lied about everything else, that girl was real and terrified and trapped in this nightmare. "You're lying." "Maybe," Luis shrugged. "Maybe Veronica was telling the truth about everything. Maybe her daughter really is in danger. Or maybe she's safe at home, eating breakfast, wondering where Mom went. You'll never know. But you have to choose. Your daughter's father, or someone else's hero. Clock's ticking." Keith looked at the gun in his hand, felt its weight. thought about Holly asleep in her unicorn pajamas, dreaming innocent dreams. If he died here, she'd wake up to police at the door and a body at the morgue, and a whole life of knowing her father had chosen violence over coming home. She'd be alone, orphaned, everything Rachel had feared. But if he walked away, if he left Zoe behind, he'd become something worse than dead. He'd become the man who let a child suffer to save himself. The man Rachel would have been ashamed to know. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "I'm walking out," Keith said slowly, "and I'm taking Zoe with me." Luis's expression hardened. "Then you die." Everything happened fast. Luis raised the AR. Keith dove left, firing as he moved. His first 2 shots went wide, adrenaline throwing his aim. Luis's rifle barked, rounds chewing into the concrete where Keith had been. Keith rolled behind a container, breathing hard. His shoulder burned where something had hit him. Not a bullet. Shrapnel from a ricochet. Blood warm and spreading. He couldn't win this fight. Luis had superior position, superior firepower, and backup coming. Keith could hear men moving through the warehouse now, closing in. He was pinned down, wounded, and running out of time. Then he heard sirens. Veronica. She'd called 911 like he'd told her, or the gunfire had drawn attention. Either way, police were coming. Luis heard them too. He swore in Spanish, fired 3 more rounds at Keith's position, then disappeared back into the office. 30 seconds later, Keith heard an engine roar to life. A loading bay door in the north wall rolled open, and headlights swept across the warehouse as a van peeled out into the night. Keith waited until the sound faded, then stumbled toward the loading dock. His shoulder screamed with every movement, blood soaked through his jacket. But he was alive. More importantly, Luis was gone. The sirens were getting closer now, maybe a minute out. Keith grabbed his phone and texted Veronica, "Get Zoe home." Then he ran. He made it 2 blocks before the shock caught up with him. He collapsed against a chain-link fence. Gasping, vision swimming. The wound in his shoulder wasn't fatal, but it was bad. He needed a hospital. But hospitals meant questions, police reports, explanations he couldn't give. He pulled off his jacket, wadded it against the wound, and kept moving. Veronica's Honda was gone. Smart. She'd taken Zoe and disappeared before the police arrived. Keith didn't know if she'd been telling the truth about anything. Didn't know if Luis had been lying or if every word was real. All he knew was that a little girl was safe, and that would have to be enough. He made it back to his truck on muscle memory and willpower. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and pain. He parked in the driveway just as the sky started to lighten. 4:47 a.m. Holly would be waking up soon, wondering where he'd gone. Keith stumbled into the house and straight to the bathroom. He locked the door, stripped off his shirt, and examined the wound in the mirror. The ricochet had torn a furrow across his shoulder, deep enough to scar, but not deep enough to hit bone. He cleaned it with peroxide that made him bite down on a towel to keep from screaming. Bandaged it with gauze and medical tape from the first aid kit. Pulled on a clean shirt that would hide the damage. When he opened the bathroom door, Holly was standing in the hallway. "Daddy?" Her voice was small, scared. "Where did you go?" Keith's throat tightened. He knelt down, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, and pulled his daughter into a hug. She felt so small against him, so precious, so completely unaware of how close she'd come to losing him. "I had to help someone," Keith said quietly. Holly pulled back, looking at his face with those 2 wise eyes she'd inherited from Rachel. "The lady with the hurt face." "Yeah. Did you break your promise?" Keith thought about Luis, about the gun in his hand, about the men he'd shot and the violence he'd sworn to leave behind. "Yeah, baby. I did." Holly was quiet for a long moment. Then she hugged him tighter and whispered, "Mom would have wanted you to help her. I know she would." Keith closed his eyes and held his daughter, and tried not to think about how close he'd come to making her an orphan. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "It's okay, Daddy. You came back. That's what matters." The next 2 weeks crawled by in a haze of healing and waiting. Keith kept expecting police to show up, to arrest him for the shooting at the warehouse. But nothing came. No detectives. No questions. Just silence. The news reported a shootout at an abandoned textile mill. 3 men wounded. Suspects fled before police arrived. The case was being investigated as gang-related. No mention of trafficking. No mention of Zoe Hayes. Keith didn't know if that meant Luis had cleaned up the evidence, or if Veronica had convinced the girl to stay quiet, or if the whole thing had been exactly what Luis said. An elaborate trap, with no real victim. The uncertainty aided him worse than the healing wound. Then, on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after the warehouse, someone knocked on his door. Keith answered it with his hand instinctively reaching for the gun that wasn't there anymore. He'd locked the cig back in the closet and thrown away the combination. Whatever he'd become that night, he couldn't let it happen again. Holly deserved better. Veronica stood on his doorstep. No bruises this time. Clean clothes, hair pulled back, eyes clear. Next to her stood Zoe, holding her mother's hand, and looking at Keith like he was something between a ghost and a guardian angel. "I'm sorry," Veronica said before Keith could speak, "for lying, for using you, for all of it." Keith's jaw tightened. Was any of it true? Most of it. Veronica's voice was steady now, no tremor of fear. "Luis did take Zoe. He did threaten to kill her if I didn't help him. But the rest, about you being the target, about it being revenge, that was all true too. He wanted you to kill again, to prove you couldn't escape what you were. Why are you here? Because you saved her anyway." Veronica looked down at Zoe. "Even after Luis told you it might be a lie, even knowing you might die. You chose to save her. That's not something I can walk away from without saying thank you." Zoe stepped forward and held out a folded piece of paper. Keith took it, opened it. A child's drawing in crayon. A stick figure man in black holding the hand of a stick figure girl in purple. Behind them, the sun was rising. Above it, in careful block letters, "Thank you for saving me." Keith's throat closed up. He looked at this 9-year-old girl who'd been used as bait, who'd been traumatized by adults playing out their revenge, who should have been broken, but was somehow standing here whole enough to draw pictures. And he thought about Holly, about how easily this could have been her. "What happened to Luis?" Keith asked. "Gone. Mexico, probably. The FBI's looking for him, but he's smart. Covered his tracks." Veronica pulled Zoe closer. "My sister's taking us in. New city, new names, fresh start. I just wanted you to know that what you did mattered, that Zoe's alive because you didn't give up on her." They left after that, disappearing into a blue sedan that drove away and didn't look back. Keith stood in his doorway holding a child's drawing and feeling the weight of every choice he'd ever made. That afternoon, he made a decision. Rachel's Haven opened 3 months later in a small storefront downtown. The sign outside was simple: free counseling for veterans and domestic violence survivors. Keith ran it with money from his Navy pension and help from other vets who understood what it meant to carry weight you couldn't put down. He wasn't a licensed therapist, but he knew how to listen, how to sit with someone's pain without trying to fix it. How to tell people that healing was possible even when it felt impossible. Holly helped on Saturdays, organizing donated clothes and serving coffee to visitors. She told everyone her dad was a hero. Keith always corrected her. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who'd made mistakes and was trying to do better, trying to honor the woman who'd believed people were worth saving. Zoe came by sometimes when Veronica was in town visiting friends. She and Holly would disappear into the back room and emerge with crafts they'd made or stories they'd written. Watching them together, Keith understood what Rachel had been trying to tell him all along. Saving people wasn't about violence. It wasn't about being the best killer or the perfect soldier. It was about choosing, every single day, to be there for someone who needed you. To show up when it would be easier to walk away. 6 months after opening the Haven, Keith got a letter. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Luis Reyes, standing in what looked like a Mexican plaza, holding a beer and smiling at the camera. On the back, in careful script, "Your move, SEAL." Keith looked at the photo for a long time, felt the old anger rising, the instinct to hunt, to finish what had been started. Then he walked to the shredder and fed the photo through, watched it turn to strips of nothing. Luis wanted him to be a weapon, wanted to prove that Keith couldn't change, couldn't be anything but a killer in civilian clothes. But Keith knew something Luis didn't. Revenge was easy. Violence was easy. What was hard was choosing peace every single day. Choosing to be the father Holly needed instead of the soldier Luis remembered. That night, Keith made pancakes with Holly. They ate on the couch and watched a movie about talking animals that made Holly laugh so hard she snorted milk out of her nose. It was ordinary. Simple. The kind of moment Rachel had died hoping he'd have with their daughter. Later, after Holly was asleep, Keith stood in the doorway of her room and watched her breathe. The scar on his shoulder ached in the cold. His hands remembered the weight of the gun. His dreams still played the sound of Rachel's last heartbeat. But standing there in the dark, listening to his daughter dream safe dreams in a safe house, Keith understood that this was the mission that mattered, not the ones he'd run in 17 countries, not the one that had nearly killed him in that warehouse. This one, being here, every single day. Outside, Portland slept under October stars. Somewhere, Luis Reyes was planning his next move. Somewhere, other fathers were losing their way. Somewhere, children were waiting for someone to save them. But here, in this small house with its secondhand furniture and walls that smelled like Sunday pancakes, Keith Brennan had finally found what he'd been searching for since the day Rachel died. Not redemption, not forgiveness, just the simple, brutal, beautiful work of being enough, of choosing again and again to be the man his daughter needed, the man Rachel had believed he could be. The gun stayed locked in the closet. The past stayed buried where it belonged. And Keith stayed here, in the present, building a future one pancake breakfast at a time. Because that's what saving people really meant. Not a single act of heroism in a warehouse at dawn, but the 1,000 small choices to be present, to be steady, to be there when it mattered most, to be human.